أعلم أنه موجود. لا بد لي من تصديق ذلك لأني أرى ردود الفعل. أرى الصور. أرى النقاد والناس الذين يتعرفون عليه في الشارع.
She was the most elegant woman in Hollywood. 2 husbands, a string of heartbreaks, and a life that looked like a fairy tale from the outside. But in her final months, Audrey Hepburn did something almost no one expected. She quietly and deliberately named the one man she never truly got over. Not one of her husbands, not a co-star, someone most people wouldn't guess. And when you find out who it was and why, the entire story of her life starts to look completely different. The marriage that slowly broke her. Most people remember Audrey Hepburn for the black dress, the pearls, the effortless grace. What they remember less is that for 14 years, she was married to a man who made her feel small. His name was Mel Ferrer. On the surface, they looked like a perfect match. Both cultured, both multilingual, both deeply invested in the arts. They met through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s, and when they were cast together in Undine, whatever spark existed offstage became impossible to ignore. By September 1954, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. For a while, the partnership worked. Ferrer took an active role in shaping her career, and Audrey, still finding her footing in Hollywood, welcomed the guidance. But there's a fine line between support and control, and over time, that line disappeared entirely. People close to the couple began to notice the shift. Ferrer had opinions about everything: which role she should take, how she should present herself publicly, who she should spend time with. What had started as a creative alliance slowly became something more suffocating. Audrey was one of the most famous women in the world, yet inside that marriage, she often deferred entirely to him. And then there was the question of children. More than almost anything else in her life, Audrey wanted to be a mother. It wasn't a casual desire. It was something she carried with a deep, almost aching urgency. In 1955, she became pregnant for the first time and miscarried. The loss was devastating. Then in 1959, she was pregnant again while filming The Unforgiven. During a scene that required her to ride a horse, she was thrown. The fall broke her back. Weeks in hospital followed. And then another miscarriage. The grief of those losses, layered on top of a marriage that was quietly closing in on her, took a visible toll. In 1960, she finally gave birth to her first son, Sean, and for a brief moment, it felt like things might stabilize. She stepped back from acting for a full year, something almost unheard of for someone at her level of fame, and devoted herself entirely to motherhood. But the marriage kept eroding. The whispers that had surrounded them for years grew louder. Rumors of Ferrer's temper, his jealousy, and eventually infidelity on both sides. After 14 years, it ended. Audrey walked away emotionally drained, but also for the first time in years free. What she didn't know was that the next relationship would hurt her in an entirely different way. The man she chose over Hollywood. By the late 1960s, Audrey Hepburn was at the absolute peak of her fame. Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady. She had become something. Beyond a film star, she was a cultural institution. And then, without warning, she walked away from all of it. The decision confused Hollywood. Studios were offering her almost anything she wanted. Directors wanted her. Audiences adored her. But Audrey had made up her mind, and the reason was not complicated. She wanted to give her son Sean the childhood she never had. Fame, in her view, was starting to cost him something she wasn't willing to let go. It was around this time, during a summer cruise in the Mediterranean, that she met Andrea Ditti. He was an Italian psychiatrist, charming, warm, socially fluent in a way that felt like a relief after the rigidity of her first marriage. The setting was almost unfairly romantic. Historic coastlines, open water, long evenings with nothing to interrupt them. Within 6 months, they were married. Audrey moved to Rome. She leaned into the idea of a quieter life. Wife, mother, private person. For a while, it looked like exactly what she had described wanting to. It looked like exactly what she had described wanting. But Ditti had a version of himself he had kept carefully hidden during those Mediterranean evenings. The affair started early and didn't stop. They weren't discreet, either. Reports of his extramarital relationships became a regular feature of the Italian press. The paparazzi, who had followed Audrey relentlessly even in Rome, made sure none of it stayed private. She had left Hollywood to escape the intrusion of public life, only to find herself living inside a very different kind of spectacle. She stayed longer than most people expected her to, partly for their son Luca, born in 1970, and partly because she was not someone who gave up easily on commitments. But the combination of Diddy's repeated betrayals and the impossibility of any real privacy eventually made the situation untenable. When the marriage finally ended, Audrey didn't talk about it at length publicly. That wasn't her style. But those close to her described the divorce as something that left her more guarded than she had ever been before. Two marriages, two very different kinds of disappointment, and underneath both of them, a pattern that stretched back much further than either relationship. What the men in her life all had in common. Here's something that gets overlooked in almost every account of Audrey Hepburn's love life. The relationships she chose and the pain she accepted within them didn't start with Mel Ferrer or Andrea Diddy. They started when she was a child. Audrey was born in Brussels in 1929. Her early years were transient. Her family moved regularly between London, Arnhem, and elsewhere, following her father Joseph Rustin's work. By the time she was still quite young, she spoke 6 languages. From the outside, it looked like a privileged cosmopolitan upbringing. What was happening underneath was something else entirely. Both of her parents had been open supporters of the Nazi regime in the 1930s, not quietly, but actively. They traveled to Germany, attended rallies, and aligned themselves publicly with its ideology. Then, in 1935, her father left. He became so absorbed in fascist politics that he walked out on Audrey and her mother entirely and relocated to London. She was 6 years old. That abandonment became the defining emotional wound of her life. She would say so herself years later. When she was sent to boarding school in Kent, she watched other children go home during holidays. She waited. Her father had visitation rights and never used them. He simply didn't come. Then the war began, and Audrey was sent to the Netherlands believing it would be safer. It wasn't. In 1940, German forces invaded. She was 10 years old, living under occupation, hiding in cellars while gunfire moved through the streets above her. She adopted a Dutch name, Edda van Heemstra, to avoid being identified as English. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were arrested and executed by the Nazis. After that, she stopped trying to stay invisible. She joined the Dutch resistance, carrying messages and underground newspapers, sometimes concealing them in her shoes. She also danced. Before the war, ballet had been her entire dream. Now she used it differently, performing at secret fundraisers for the resistance, in rooms where no one could applaud because a single sound might give them all away. By 1944, famine had swept through the Netherlands during one of the coldest winters on record. German blockades had cut off food supplies. Audrey's family ate tulip bulbs. Her health deteriorated. Malnutrition, anemia, respiratory illness. The girl who would later become one of the most photographed women of the 20th century was, at that moment, a starving teenager. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker gave her a chocolate bar. She never forgot it. Psychologists who have studied her life in depth have pointed to her father's abandonment as the lens through which almost everything else needs to be understood. The men she was drawn to tended to be older, authoritative, and in control. Ferrer fit that profile exactly. So in a different way, did he? She wasn't naive. She was, in many ways, unconsciously searching for the stability her father had taken with him when he left. And what made it more complicated was that she eventually found him. In the 1960s, using the Red Cross, she tracked down Joseph Rustin. He had been living in Dublin since 1939, the same year he had driven her to the airport and sent her away. She approached the reunion hoping for something. Warmth, perhaps. Acknowledgement. Some form of repair. What she found was a man who offered almost nothing in return. He was distant, indifferent. The reconciliation she had carried in her imagination for decades simply didn't happen. She forgave him anyway. More than that, She supported him financially for the rest of his life. That detail says more about Audrey Hepburn than almost any film she ever made. The relationship nobody took seriously enough. Before her 2 marriages, before the heartbreak that defined her 30s and 40s, there was William Holden. It started on the set of Sabrina in 1954. The atmosphere was already uncomfortable before filming began. Humphrey Bogart had wanted the role to go to his wife, Lauren Bacall, and when the studio chose Audrey instead, he didn't disguise his resentment. He kept his distance, made his feelings known through silence and cold professionalism, and treated her as an unwelcome presence on a set he felt she didn't deserve to be on. Holden responded to her in the exact opposite way. From their first interactions, he was drawn to her completely. The chemistry between them was not manufactured for the cameras. It was real, and everyone around them could see it. Their connection deepened quickly, and what began as closeness during production became a full romantic relationship behind the scenes. For a brief period, it was genuinely intense. Holden fell hard. He asked her to marry him. Audrey said no. The reason was not complicated, but it was final. She wanted children, and Holden had already undergone a vasectomy. That was not a detail she could set aside. As much as she felt for him, the future she was building in her mind had children at the center of it, and he couldn't be part of that future. Holden was heartbroken. He never entirely moved on. What's interesting, in retrospect, is where Holden fits in the larger story. He wasn't the man who broke her, but he was the one who showed, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, just how much she guarded herself after being hurt. She felt something real with him. She walked away anyway, because she had learned, early and painfully, that wanting something and trusting someone with your future were 2 entirely different things. The quiet life, the final love, and the name she never stopped saying. After the divorce from Andrea Ditti, Audrey Hepburn did something had surprised people who expected her to return to the screen with renewed energy. She went quiet, not in a temporary way, in a considered, deliberate way. She moved to a farmhouse in Tollekinaz, Switzerland, a place she called La Paisible, which translates simply to the peaceful one. The name was not accidental. She turned down major roles. She avoided the social circuit. She spent time in her garden, walked her dogs, cooked meals, and lived in a way that would have been entirely unrecognizable to anyone who knew only the Audrey Hepburn of Roman Holiday and Breakfast at Tiffany's. Neighbors in Tollekinaz later recalled that she was simply a neighbor, someone who said good morning at the market and didn't need to be anything more. It was in this period that Robert Wolders came into her life. They met at a charity auction in the late 1970s. Wolders was a Dutch actor and businessman who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon, after a long illness. Their first exchange was quiet, unremarkable on the surface. He invited her somewhere shortly after. She declined. She had work. But the following day, she reached out. She suggested they meet for a drink. That drink became a conversation that lasted hours. The conversations became daily phone calls. The phone calls became something neither of them had expected. What they built together was not glamorous. That was precisely the point. Both had lived through enough loss, enough public exposure, enough relationships that had asked them to be something other than themselves. What they offered each other was simpler than anything either had experienced before. Steadiness. Respect. A shared preference for the unhurried and the real. They never married formally. Audrey didn't feel the need. She introduced him as her husband, not because the paperwork existed, but because in every way that mattered to her, the commitment was already complete. For over a decade, they shared La Paisible, its garden, its rhythms, its silence. Then, in 1988, at a UNICEF concert she attended simply as a guest, Audrey found herself standing on a stage, speaking without a script about hunger, about occupation, about what it meant to be a child in wartime. A senior UNICEF official was in the audience. By the end of the evening, he had offered her a full ambassadorship. She accepted, and the years that followed took her to Ethiopia, to Sudan, to Bangladesh, to El Salvador, some of the most difficult environments on earth. She sat with children in conditions that mirrored what she had lived through in the Netherlands 50 years earlier. Those who accompanied her on these missions consistently noted that she didn't treat it as an obligation. She treated it as something unfinished, a debt she felt she owed to the version of herself that a UNICEF worker had once handed a chocolate bar to after liberation. Wolders traveled with her on many of these missions. He was present not as a companion managing a celebrity schedule, but as someone who simply refused to let her do the hardest parts alone. In 1992, after returning from a humanitarian trip to Somalia, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Testing in Los Angeles revealed pseudomyxoma peritoneal, a rare and aggressive form of cancer originating in the appendix. Surgery was performed quickly, but the disease had already spread too far. The diagnosis was terminal. She absorbed that news the way she had absorbed most difficult things in her life, without visible collapse. Those around her in those final months spoke about her composure in terms that made it sound almost unsettling, because it was so complete. What she expressed most was not fear of death, but regret about the work she would leave unfinished. She had one request: to go home. She was too fragile to travel commercially. It was Hubert de Givenchy, her friend of nearly 40 years, the designer who had clothed her through the most iconic chapters of her public life, who arranged a private jet and made the journey possible. She arrived home to La Paisible. She spent a final Christmas there, surrounded by the people who mattered most. In a gesture that people who were present have described as quietly characteristic of her, she gave gifts with specific intention. Winter coats for the three men she was closest to: Wolders, her son Sean, and Givenchy. On January 20th, 1993, she died peacefully at home. Her funeral was held at a small local church in Tolikinas. It was intimate, as she would have wanted. Gregory Peck, her co-star from Roman Holiday 4 decades earlier, the man who had insisted she receive equal billing on a film where she was entirely unknown, read one of her favorite poems. Her former husbands were present. Her sons were present. Wolders stood among them, the one man she never got over. So who was he? After 2 failed marriages, after Holden, after Diddy, after all of it, who was the man Audrey Hepburn named her final years as the one she never truly got over? It wasn't a romantic partner. That's the part most people get wrong. It was her father, not in a sentimental way, not in the way people say they miss someone they loved simply. In the way a wound that never closes continues to shape everything around it. Joseph Rustin left when she was 6. He didn't visit when she waited at school during holidays. He sent her to the Netherlands believing it would be safer, and when she landed in the middle of a war zone, he wasn't there. When she found him through the Red Cross decades later, living quietly in Dublin, he greeted the reunion with indifference. She had built an entire emotional mythology around a man who had almost nothing to offer her when she finally stood in front of him. And she still forgave him. She still sent money. She still carried him. In interviews conducted in the final years of her life, Audrey returned to him with a consistency that those who knew her well found striking. Not with bitterness. She wasn't built for sustained bitterness, but with a kind of unresolved wondering. What had he been thinking? Whether he had ever felt the absence the way she had. Whether, somewhere in him, there had been something that simply couldn't be expressed. She never got a satisfying answer. He died without giving her one. Those who have studied her life in depth, including the biographers who were granted access to personal correspondence and the accounts of people close to her in Switzerland, have made the case that every major romantic decision she made traces back to that original absence. The older men, the authoritative figures, the willingness to stay in relationships well past the point they had stopped working. Even the way she devoted her final years to UNICEF, specifically to children in crisis, children who had lost the structures they depended on, carried the shape of something personal. She once said, in one of the most quoted lines from her later interviews, that she believed the best thing you could leave your children was the feeling of being loved. It was a simple statement, but given everything she had lived through and everything she had spent her life searching for, it was also something more. It was the thing she had needed most and received least. And she spent the rest of her life, through her work, her parenting, and ultimately her humanitarian missions, trying to give it to others. Robert Wolders, who knew her better in her final decade than almost anyone, said afterward that what struck him most about Audrey was not her beauty or her talent. It was her capacity for forgiveness. Not the easy kind. The kind that requires you to continue loving someone who gave you almost no reason to. She never stopped loving her father. She never stopped grieving him either. And in that paradox, that long, unresolved grief for the first man who was supposed to stay, is perhaps the truest thing anyone has ever said about who Audrey Hepburn really was. It's time to hear from you in the comments below. What are your thoughts about what's been revealed? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories like this.